Well, as I just said, this is Unit 2.1. We're talking about some basic assumptions of theories of comprehension. And specifically, we'll spend some time talking about this construct called propositions. Okay, so here is the text. I'm going to read it for you, but if you don't want to listen to my voice, you can mute me or you can pause this and read it yourself and come back to this in the next slide. Okay, so there is an interesting story about the telescope. In Holland, a man named Lippershey was an eyeglass maker. One day, children were playing with some lenses. They discovered that things seemed very close if two lenses were held about a foot apart. Lippershey began experimenting, and his spyglass attracted much attention. He sent a letter about it to Galileo, the great Italian scientist. Galileo at once realized the importance of the discovery and set about to build an instrument of his own. He used an old organ pipe with one lens curved out and the other in. On the first night, he pointed the glass toward the sky. He was amazed to find the empty dark spaces filled with bright gleaming stars. Night after night, Galileo climbed to a high tower, sweeping the sky with his telescope. One night, he saw Jupiter, and to his surprise, discovered near it three bright stars, two to the east and one to the west. On the next night, however, all were to the west. A few nights later, there were four little stars. This passage is taken from Sachs 19. Okay, and we'll come back to this paragraph later. I just wanted to read it to understand. Welcome back. We are in Unit 2, and as we discussed before, there are four mental process related pieces we need to talk about. And before that, I said that we have other fundamental pieces like puzzle, language, comprehension theories, and comprehension processes. And in the last unit, which was Unit 1, we talked about language and processes. And in this unit, Unit 2, we'll talk about comprehension theories. And I've divided this topic into two units if you may. 2.1 and 2.2. 2.1 will talk about some basic assumptions of comprehension theories in general, and particularly we'll talk about a construct called proposition. In 2.2, we'll talk about specific comprehension theories, and we'll talk about three most prominent comprehension theories. Well, let's get started. So the outcomes for this particular video lecture are, first we'll talk about basic assumptions of cognitive theories or comprehension theories. And then we'll talk about the construct called proposition and how we can represent propositions for our convenience and discussion sake. And then we'll talk about steps specific to extracting propositions, and we talk about are propositions real, referring to a specific experiment. Now, here is a fundamental assumption of theories of comprehension. According to theories of comprehension, when we especially read something, right, but it may equally apply to situations where we experience an event or watch an event or listen to a story. But we're gonna specifically talk about text comprehension. When we read something, the idea according to these theories is that you extract meaning from what you read. And this extracted meaning from what you read is then, suppose this is a text, right? And you're reading, say you read first paragraph. You extracted meaning from this and you represent the meaning in your mind. That is the main idea. Extract the meaning and represent the meaning in the mind. Extract the meaning from what you're reading and represent that meaning in your mind. And the nature, the way this particular meaning is extracted and represented, the format of it is called proposition. It's called proposition. And we'll talk more about proposition in the following slides. And so what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that when you read something, you're extracting meaning. That's the very important construct. Another important construct is that you are extracting that extracted meaning is represented in your mind as proposition. And these propositions, which are the units of meaning that you have represented in your mind, this network of propositions in your mind, which are meaning representations, they form your long-term memory. So these are stored in your long-term memory. Does it make sense? So the main assumptions are that you extract meaning from what you read, and this extracted meaning is represented in our minds. And these representations form part of our long-term memory. And now that we looked at the general assumptions of comprehension theories, that we extract meaning in the form of propositions, before we go to specifically look at different ways of representing propositions. Okay, so you read a passage earlier, and I want you to answer this question without going back to the actual slide. Which of the following sentences you think occurred word to word in the text you heard or read before? Is it A, he sent a letter about it to Galileo, the great Italian scientist? Or B, Galileo, the great Italian scientist, was sent a letter about it by him? Or C, he sent Galileo, the great Italian scientist, a letter about it? Or D, Galileo, the great Italian scientist, sent him a letter about it? Now, pause here for a second and come back and see if you can accurately remember the exact sentence. Okay, I hope you paused. The answer is A, and most of you probably remember it still because it's still fresh in your memory. But if there was enough gap between when you read the text and when you encountered this question, most likely you forget the exact wording. The idea here is that when we read a text, we extract meaning and represent it the meaning. The meaning being the meaning, not exact words. This is an important construct. This meaningful unit of the text you read is called a proposition. A proposition is a simple, meaningful unit. That's the construct called proposition. We'll talk more about propositions in the next slides, but I just kind of give an idea that when we read something, we extract meaning and store meaning, and we define that meaningful unit as a proposition. That meaningful unit doesn't need to necessarily have, and it won't for the most time, the exact wording. It captures the essence of the meaning conveyed by a particular sentence. And we all assume that, and we call these meaningful units propositions. Now, I want you to think about why, in the first place, there was this idea that was developed called proposition mind. Now, the researchers needed a way to quantify, to measure these meaningful units and see. So to quantify that, researchers, they came up with the idea of propositions, or they borrowed it from linguists or from other fields. And the idea is very simple. Any given information can be divided into most basic units of meaning, a unit that only captures one unit of idea. So for instance, sky is blue is just a proposition with only one simple idea that it's a blue sky. Robin is a bird is also a simple idea where you're talking about Robin being a bird. A robin has wings is also a simple idea where there is a robin that has the property of having wings. Thomas Alva Edison discovered electric bulb. Now it has two ideas here if you pay attention to it. Can you think of what those two ideas are? Right. It has two ideas in the sense that Edison invented, sorry, bulb would be one idea, and that the fact that the bulb was electric was the another idea. So do you understand the concept here? So a closest um, analogy or a construct in grammatical English is basically a simple sentence. A proposition is a simple sentence. Also, it's not just a simple sentence that carries a simple single unit of meaning, but it also has a truth value to it. In other words, a statement proposition is a single sentence or single idea unit that is either true or false, but not both. That would make a proposition. Now, as we just discussed, a sentence can have more than two meaningful units. In fact, the tests we read are not written in simple sentences, correct? They are written in multiple complex or more complex sentences, and that's what makes reading different, difficult, easy, or interesting. So the idea of proposition was created to theorize and also to quantify this concept of meaningful units. So now that we defined our propositions and have some idea of what it is, let's talk about different ways of representing them. Remember, this idea is created, right? This theoretical construct of a meaningful unit, and there are different ways of actually representing it for our convenience. It's not that the way we're talking about now is the exact way it is represented in our minds. It's a theoretical construct. And we will talk about in the next slide different ways that researchers use to talk about these constructs called propositions. So we'll talk about ways of representing propositions in the next slide. Okay, so coming to different ways of representing them. There are at least three important ways I want you to know. Although we'll mostly use this particular way of representing propositions, we refer to this method as we go, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the different ways of representing it. Okay, so I can keep in mind, these are not the ways in which we expect the information is exactly represented in our mind when we extract meaning, but this is for researchers to give a sense of the nature of the propositions as opposed to the exact structure of it in our minds. Having made that clear, let's talk about three different ways. The first way is called the nodes and pathways method. In this method, you basically have two nodes and a pathway. A node is also called a concept. So in a sentence, Thomas Alva Edison actually should be invented. I don't care. I understand the point here. It's a verb. Thomas Alva Edison invented a bulb. It's one idea, right? It has two concepts. Edison itself is a concept noun. Bulb is a concept noun. But the actual verb that connect these two would be the pathway. So this is the simplest way of representing propositions, nodes and pathway, or concepts and pathways. Concepts are nouns and pathways are the actual content, the verb represented in the proposition. So that's the nodes and pathway method. The second method of representing propositions is propositional method, where instead of making the pathway itself as the sender, we actually have a node that says proposition. Let's say it's proposition 1, right? And this particular proposition has at least three important components to it. And these important components are agent, recipient, and relation. Let's talk about what these are in a second. Now, the idea is that, and when we talk about theories of comprehension, it will give you a better understanding of why we have these specific parts to a proposition. Now, usually when these theories of comprehension were written, most of the text that was read was the narratives, the novels, right, the stories. And most of the stories have some kind of event that gets unfolded, and this event has some form of action, right? And when there is an action, there is somebody doing the action. And when there is somebody doing the action, it is on something. So the proposition captures this essence, these things about the action itself, which is called relation. In this case, it is the verb invented, and the person doing the action, which is the agent, in this case, Thomas Alva Edison, and the recipient who receives the action, which is invention, right? That would be bulb, the recipient. So this would be a simple propositional representation. An extension of that is the elaborated propositional method, where you still have the same proposition node at the center, then you have the relation itself, which is a verb invented, then you have the agent, the recipient, but you have more information, whether it is, say, is it past tense, present tense, or future tense, which is time. So what you're adding more is time and location. In this sentence, there is no location, but if, for example, there is a sentence that has information about a location, that also becomes a part of it. For instance, you can say Thomas Alva Edison invented electric bulb in Germany. So this elaborated propositions will have agent, relation, recipient, time, which is past tense, and the location itself. So proposition then, this propositional method, elaborated propositional method, is what we'll use as we talk about these things and different theories. So bottom line, what is a proposition? It's a meaningful unit. There's different ways of representing it. We adopt this elaborated propositional method, which has five important structures. The relation, which is usually the verb, or it can be an adjective, or it can be an adverb. Again, I repeat it, usually a verb or an adjective or an adverb. Then the agent who does the action, then the recipient who receives the action, then time when the action happened, and location where it happened. These are the important components of elaborated of an. Okay, so coming to the steps for extracting propositions, there are four individual steps. The first step is, if you take this example here, you list all the relations. You find all the relations in a given sentence. For example, this sentence is, the genius Thomas Alva Edison invented electric bulb in Germany. Now, you have to find the relations and list them. Remember, a relation is either a verb, an adverb, or an adjective, right? So, can you think of it? Can you pause here for a second and identify these three? Okay, I hope you identified one is the main verb, right? Invented. is one relation. Then Thomas Alva Edison invented electric bulb, the genius, right? There's an adjective, so this becomes the second relation. Third relation is that the bulb was Germany. Sorry, the bulb was electric. So these are the three relations. So the idea is that you list these three relations. That would be the first step. The second step is to create simple sentences specific to each of these relations. So a simple sentence for invented would be Thomas Alva Edison invented bulb. For genius, it would be Thomas Alva Edison was genius. For electric bulb, it would be the bulb was electric. And once you have these three simple sentences, then you draw propositions for each of these simple sentences. Remember, we talked about three different ways of representing it. We'll use the last one, the elaborated propositional method. So you'll draw simple propositions for each of those relational sentences. Then the last step is you combine all these propositions into one complex proposition that captures the essence, the meaning of that particular sentence. And that's what is represented in our mind when we read something. Now, another way to look at it is that you take the main proposition, which is the main verb invented, right? Then you add the other propositions you have created for other relations, like electric bulb and genius at appropriate points. So that would be a simple way to form a complex representation. So we'll look at these particular four steps in the same example sentence, but more visually in the next slide. Okay, so let's look at these four steps in action. Take the same example sentence, which is the genius Thomas Alva Edison invented electric bulb. And we said the step one is to find and list all the relations in the term, in the sentence. And we know that the three relations are invented is the main relation, genius is the second one, and electric is the third one. So you've listed these three relations here, right? That is step one. Step two is you generate simple sentences related to each of these sentences. So, sorry, each of these relations. It should be relations. So the first simple sentence is related to invented. So what would that sentence be? It is Thomas Alva Edison invented bulb. In fact, you can add in Germany here. Then the second is genius. Right? A simple sentence related to that would be Thomas Alva Edison was genius. The information is missing here. Sorry about that. And the third one is electric. The bulb was electric is the third sentence. So we have three simple sentences related to three different relations that you captured, identified in this complex sentence. Now the third step is to draw propositions for each of these simple sentences. Right? So we're going to have one proposition, simple proposition for this sentence. So let's see how you can represent the first sentence, right? Here, Thomas Alva Edison invented bulb in Germany, let's say. So you can have proposition itself, the relation is invented, so you draw one arrow that says relation, and you have invented. Then you have the agent, Thomas Alva Edison, then you have the recipient, the bulb, correct? It's a propositional, the complex one, right? Elaborated. So Thomas Alva Edison invented it. Invented is in the past tense, so the time would be past tense. And also has in Germany, so the location will be where did he invent it? Well, that is related to the fourth component, the last component, the location. So this is a proposition for the single main sentence, which is Thomas Alva Edison invented bulb in Germany. Now we can do the same thing with the other sentence, which is Thomas Alva Edison was genius. So we're going to have proposition. Let's call this proposition one. Let's call this proposition two. Proposition two has the relation genius, right? And this, which is adjective, and this adjective was about Thomas Alva Edison, right? So the only thing it has is the agent, which is Thomas Alva Edison, saying that Thomas Alva Edison was genius. But it also has past tense to it, like Thomas Alva Edison was genius, right? So it also has the component of time to it. I'm going to say past tense. Good? Okay. Now let's move on to this third sentence. It says the bulb was electric. Again, let's call it proposition three. It has a main relation electric. It has, what do you say? The main agent, actually, it should agent here, I'm sorry about that, is the bulb, because the bulb was electric, right? And it is past tense because it bulb was electric. So this is a simple proposition. So let's move on to the fourth step now. The fourth step is combining these individual simple propositions to form one complex big proposition. The different ways of doing, one way, easy way to do it is take the main proposition and add the elements from the other propositions at an appropriate place. So if you look at it, what is the common structure for this proposition and this proposition? The common structure or the additional structure is a bulb, and you can add it to Thomas Alva Edison. See.
Okay, so the fourth step is to combine these individual propositions. The easiest way to do is basically take this particular proposition one, which is the main proposition because it's the main verb invented. And I've represented that here, right? In blue. Then add the relations specific to the other two propositions, but at appropriate places. For instance, this original blue proposition is proposition one, right? And proposition two has a relation of genius, which is basically related to Thomas Alva Edison as the agent. So you add this genius relation to Thomas Alva Edison. And similarly, the relation here in the third proposition is the electric related to the agent bulb. So you need to find bulb, then add the relation electric to it. You see that? So you could have started with this and added stuff, but I just wanted to give you a general idea of the individual steps first before giving you this particular thing. So these are the four steps. Now you have represented this particular sentence in the form of a complex proposition. And the idea is that when you read something, you extract propositions and represent the meaning conveyed in individual propositions in the form of a complex network of propositions. Okay, I hope you liked it.
Okay, this brings us to the last outcome for this particular video. So here we're going to talk about, well, these propositions, are they real? We know these are theoretical constructs, but do we actually operate at this level, in the sense that what is the evidence to support the idea that propositions actually exist, the idea units? So that's what we'll talk about in the next slide, a couple of slides, especially by referring back to the experiment that Sachs conducted in 1967, and you actually read that text in the beginning, if you remember. Sachs in 1967, she made participants read a story like the one you actually read in the beginning. And the target sentence, if you remember, was this particular sentence, right? So the interesting thing what Sachs did was, after reading a target sentence with some delay or without any delay, participants were presented with a question, the kind that you actually saw yourself. Which of the following sentences occurred in the text you read so far? Then the participants have to select an accurate option that they think they saw in the text. But the interesting thing is that Sachs presented participants either immediately after reading the sentence, in which case she called it after reading 0 syllables, syllables referring to the number of syllables after reading a target sentence, or after reading, say, 80 syllables, which may be roughly equivalent to a sentence or two, or 160 syllables, even further along. So the idea is to see if participants would accurately remember the exact nature of the sentence, and if it differs as a function of immediately recalling it versus recalling it after reading something else along the lines of related to the text. So in the next slide, we'll look at the parts of the experiment. And the following slide, we'll look at the results. Okay, so as I said before, the task in this experiment was for the participants to read a text, then at specific points while reading a text, after reading specific sentences, they were asked to identify which of the following sentences they saw in the text they've read so far. But that cue came after a delay, either immediately after reading the target sentence, in which case 0 syllables, that's one level of the IB, or after reading 80 syllables after reading the target sentence, in which case that is second level of the IB, or further along after reading 160 syllables after reading the target sentence. So these are the three levels of one IB, which is the delay of recognition task. The other thing that Sachs manipulated was the kind of options that was provided to the participants. Remember, there are 4 different options, but these 4 different options were created so they have some specific elements in them. For instance, the first one is a verbatim. That is the exact sentence they write, in which case it has both the structure, word to word structure, and the meaning embedded in it. The second option is a paraphrase. And also, if you look at it, the form of the sentence is also changed, where it is not direct. As you can see, he sent a letter versus Galileo was sent a letter. So it's paraphrase, meaning is the same, but the form is changed. The third option is a paraphrase, but the form is not changed. He sent Galileo. The last one is an inaccurate option. So participants, if they select, the question is, would they select this over this, or would there be any difference among these 3 basically options that have a similar meaning? So, and the DV was recognition accuracy. And we look at the results in the next section. I mean to say in the next slide. Okay, these are the results. Just to give you an idea of this chart first, the x-axis refers to one of the IVs, which is the delay between reading the target sentence and the Q question that was asked with 4 options in it. Either it was presented immediately after reading the target sentence, or after 80 syllables after reading the target sentence, or after 160 syllables after reading the target sentence. That was one of them. The other IV was the kind of options they were given, right? One was verbatim, it's represented blue here. The two are paraphrases of different forms, which are represented here in 2 lines, and the green one is inaccurate, that's the other level. And if you look at it, let's look at one IV first, which is immediately after reading it. Immediately after reading a target sentence, when participants were presented with questions, they said they accurately selected option A, the verbatim. In other words, initially, immediately after reading a text, they had the verbatim information about it. They remember the meaning. They also had the exact grammatic structure of it. And as you can see, there were few instances where participants selected either a paraphrase of either kind or an inaccurate option. Let's see what happens in this condition where participants were presented with the cue after 80 syllables into it. And if you look at this, accuracy, right, participants' likelihood to select the accurate option, it immediately drops, where they're kind of selecting any of the 3 options equally, option A, B, and C, the exact verbatim versus the 2 synonyms, but they were not selecting the inaccurate option. Even further, after 160 syllables, it is even clear that there was no difference in how frequently they selected the verbatim or any of the paraphrases, but not the inaccurate. Suggesting that as you keep reading with the time, you lose the exact wording, and what remains is basically meaning representation. So the conclusion then is that the exact wording is not what we represent, but we represent the meaning conveyed, and given the fact that there's no actual difference whether it's a direct form or passive form or verbatim, it seems like we retain the meaning conveyed in a sentence or in a text as opposed to the actual nature of it. But other researchers continued these experiments and found that, well, it may be the case that we don't remember the exact wording in general, but for some specific situations, we tend to equally remember the verbatim, in fact, more than the paraphrases, especially in instances where there is some utility to retaining the exact wording. Can you think of any example, any instance? You can pause here for a second and think, like, when do you think a reader would pay more attention to the exact wording? Yeah, especially when there is a joke, there's a punchline, right? And for you to actually appreciate the joke, you should be able to retain that punchline exact wording better. Or in instances where people read poems, right? Even there, you see that the wording, exact wording, the verbatim representation has higher likelihood of staying in our memory just because of the given context. In general, though, we tend to lose the exact verbatim nature of what we read, but we retain only the meaning of it. Okay? So, are propositions real then? Well, with Sachs' experiment and several other researchers, there is consistent evidence to suggest that we tend to retain the meaningful units of a text as opposed to the exact nature of the structure. We'll talk more about these things, these constructs, as we talk about the comprehension theories in the unit 2.2. So they're real? Yes, it seems like they're real. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this unit. We talked about the assumptions of comprehension theories in general. Then we talked about what propositions are and different ways of representing them. Then we also talked about 4 steps of extracting propositions. Then we looked at the experiment as evidence to support the actual presence of propositions, whether or not we actually extract meaningful units. Well, stay tuned, and in the next year video in unit 2.2, we'll talk about comprehension theories. Have fun learning.